Hello. After recording the two videos on Genesis 10:15 through 18 that had to do with the 11 descendants of Canaan, the Lord began to bring certain thoughts into my heart and mind, some additional thoughts, and I felt led in the Spirit to record this video, which will be, in a sense, like a postscript, a PS, to the other two videos. We will not be adding what will be shared here as part of the summary, the written summary. It will be like a verbal addendum to the other two videos, and these are random thoughts that are related to that sequence of the 11 descendants of Canaan. And I believe in my spirit that as these thoughts were being placed in our hearts, especially a few days ago, around Wednesday or Thursday of last week, it seems as if certain things were being unleashed in the spirit realm, and I pray that as we share these things, that those things that were being released will be opened in the spirit of your eyes. So one of the first things that the Lord wanted us to mention quickly is a certain pattern that can be seen in the sequence that might not be obvious at first sight. As you may recall, I hope you can see that on the video, we have the famous triangle of evil that we have talked about on the Shamah-Elim website. This is the triangle that comprises the 7 evil spirits. They operate in this triangle structure, and we saw that the first descendant of Canaan that is mentioned in Genesis 10:15 through 18 is Sidon. And Sidon means hunting, and as we saw before, he is like the overriding theme of the list. It's as if God is saying, this list is about how the Canaanite spirit hunts people down, because Sidon means hunting. So that is kind of the overriding theme of the list. We'll just put it here to the left of the list. And we saw that the first descendant after Sidon that is mentioned is Heth, and Heth correlates with the Hittite spirit. So let's start here in the triangle. The first evil spirit that is mentioned is Heth and the Hittites, because Hittite means son of Heth. And then the next one that is mentioned is the Jebusite, and as you may recall, the Jebusite spirit is here in the triangle of evil, the Jebusite. And then the next one that is mentioned is the Amorite. So if you notice, it goes from Hittite to Jebusite, and then from Jebusite to Amorite. So in a certain sense, you start by covering the top 3 evil spirits in the triangle of evil: the Hittite, the Jebusite, and the Amorite spirits. So by the end, as we have shared on the website, the Amorite spirit is the evangelistic anointing gone bad. The Hittite spirit is the prophetic endowment gone bad, and the Jebusite spirit is the apostolic endowment gone bad. And these 3 happen to be the 3 male ministries: apostle, prophet, and evangelist, male in their functionality, as opposed to female, which are the pastor and the teacher endowments. So notice that the first thing that the Canaanite spirit does to hunt you down is to destroy your male nature, to kind of castrate you in a sense, to deprive you of your spiritual manhood in a certain sense, by distorting and kind of neutralizing the male anointings in you, and therefore after that the rest of the list dabbles in the lower spirits, and that makes sense because the Canaanite spirit is a spirit of low passions. The word Canaanite literally means lowlands, so it has the connotation of somebody sinking to a low level and operating in the low. So therefore, the next spirit that is referenced by the list is the Girgashite spirit, and then it goes to the Hivite spirit, and then to the Canaanite spirit, and then to the Perizzite spirit. So you can see that after the male anointings have been neutralized, the Canaanite spirit leaves you dabbling in the low spirits, and it does kind of a crisscross situation here, Girgashite to Hivite. So you enjoy your island of hedonistic delight, and then it gets you down to a dog state at the Canaanite spirit. This is the Girgashite, as you may recall. This is the Hivite spirit. This is the Canaanite spirit, and this is the Perizzite spirit. And I'm sorry for writing it so informally, but we have gone through this in the other videos, so that's why we're not being very formal with the depiction here. But and as you may recall, the Girgashite spirit is the teacher gone bad. So this is the teacher gone bad, and the Canaanite spirit is the pastor gone bad. So we have the two female ministries here operating and the two village spirits. But the important thing to mention here is that the Canaanite spirit neutralizes your male anointings, and then it leaves you dabbling in the lowlands of the female ministries and the village spirits. So that's one thing that the Lord wanted us to share. A second thing that is very important is the fact that, as you may recall, first comes Sidon, then comes Heth, and then it starts with the list of descendants that are mentioned as tribal names: the Jebusite, the Amorite, not as proper names, but as the names of a group of people. And we explained we shared what that meant in the previous videos. But the thing is that the first tribal spirit that is mentioned is the Jebusite spirit. So, and every spirit that is mentioned here, it has to be seen from the context of the Canaanite spirit, because the list is about the 11 descendants of Canaan. So the fact that the Jebusite spirit is the first one that is mentioned, it has a lot of relevance. So we can't just see it as a Jebusite spirit on its own. We have to see it in the context of the Canaanite spirit, and at least in the context of this list. And the Canaanite, so when the Lord mentions the Jebusite influence, we have to think in terms of a Canaanite-Jebusite combination that is working there to trap you under the Canaanite spirit. And when you think of the Canaanite-Jebusite combination, then it brings to mind a certain animal, or a certain biological being, as we have shared on the website, especially if I'm not mistaken in the Rain in Spain posting. We talk about the fact that when you combine the Canaanite and the Jebusite spirit, you get spiritual flies. And so in other words, you get Canaanite and combine it with Jebusite, and that gives you flies. That's how you get flies in the spiritual realm. And as we share in the frogs posting as well, the frogs posting and the Rain in Spain posting, flies are Canaanite because of their contamination. They are dirty animals that propagate disease. And they are Jebusite because they manifest qualities of Jebusite anger. If you have been in a place with a lot of flies, you will know that they are very vengeful animals. If you attack them, if you swat them away, they will oftentimes come, and it's as if they know that they can annoy you by buzzing around your ear and flying by it to kind of show you that they are getting back at you for having attacked them. And another quality that is well known about flies is that they have a lot of eyes, and as we share on the website, eyes speak of judgment. And Jebusites are apostles gone bad, and an apostle, the apostolic endowment is one of judgment. So it makes sense that flies have lots of eyes, which is a figure of somebody applying judgments, but they are contaminated judgments, unrighteous Canaanite judgments instead of God's judgments. And that's why flies have all those eyes. They are going around judging people, but not in the spirit, but in the soul. And that is a very important concept to consider, or to have in mind when we're thinking about the Canaanite spirit coming to attack us, and how it moves in the lives of other people. As we share, if I'm not mistaken, somewhere on the website, there's a passage in Ecclesiastes that talks about the fact that if you say something about the king in secret, then there will be winged creatures who will go tell the king what you said in private. And when you see passages like that in Scripture, what they're doing is revealing spiritual principles, and it's very important to see them from a you could say not a mechanical but a logical or law-oriented point of view. All God is doing there is describing a law, a principle, like a chemical reaction. If you have this and this, it will produce this. But it is just a law, and it doesn't mean that that it's saying that something is good or evil. In other words, that passage doesn't mean that you shouldn't ever say anything against what is considered in the flesh an authority figure, because you could take that passage to mean that you should never say anything evil about or anything improper or any judgment against anybody who's recognized as a kingly figure in one way or another, because you're going to be told on by some winged creature that will make it known to the king, and then you'll be in trouble. But all that it's saying is that whenever you stand up and speak against the king, then you can rest assured that there will be, spiritually speaking, winged creatures in the atmosphere that will somehow make it known to the king that you oppose him, and so that means that, and therefore it's not an indictment against speaking out against the king. It is just expressing a principle. Otherwise, the prophets who would speak out against kings and judge them in the spirit would be sinning against God. So you can't take that passage to mean that you can't speak out against the king. It is just saying, if you speak out against the king, then you can rest assured that there will be spiritual influences in the air that will hear that and somehow transmit it to the king. And the king will have the sense that there's somebody out there speaking out against him, because it is just a spiritual law taking place. Just like when you drop something, it falls to the ground because there's a law of gravity in this case that pulls the object towards the center of the earth. So that's what that passage is saying. And so you can see it from the context of a good king or a bad king. When you speak out against a good king, there will be angels. Those winged creatures will be angels that will make it known to the king that you have spoken out against him, and then there will be the consequence of these angels returning to make judgment against you. But if you're speaking of against an evil king, then those winged creatures are flies, and therefore it's not a coincidence that in our common culture we speak of people being flies on a wall, like when people say, "Oh, I wish I was a fly on the wall that day during that meeting," because they would like to be there listening to what's being said without being noticed. So that's what the fly represents. It's like a winged creature that is hovering somewhere where it can't be seen, judging, looking at what you're saying about the authority figure, and then making it known to the king what you have said against him, so that the king will then come against you. Those same winged creatures will come back against you to attack you and destroy you for what you have said. And that's the type of influence that the Canaanite spirit operates in. It's very fly oriented. It's like like as we saw in the previous videos, one of the atmospheres that people can be exposed to that is very Canaanite is the modern high school. When you go in spiritually, it's like there's a ton of flies all over the place on the walls, because in that atmosphere it's as if you feel this pressure on you to act a certain way, to dress a certain way, to behave a certain way, and that is prototypical of how the Canaanite spirit operates. You feel that there's somebody watching you that will judge you and condemn you if you do not behave in accordance with a certain set of laws and rules. And it's a Jebusite soulish pressure that comes upon you. And so you have to be very aware of the fly. One influence that attacks people who have a judgment anointing, an apostolic judgment anointing, is that you get, for example, labeled as a person who doesn't have love, who is ruthless, who is always condemning others, and is bitter and resentful. And you start getting that pressure on you to be, quote unquote, nicer, to be more understanding, more cool. If you have, I'm sure you have noticed that the word cool in the modern culture is associated with somebody who accepts unrighteousness, who doesn't quote unquote fly off the handle when he or she sees something that is improper. Like a cool parent is a parent that lets the kid do whatever he wants because he's not judging the kid. He's okay with the kid doing many things that should supposedly cause the parent to get angry. So there's all these flies hovering around you, trying to get you to believe that you are not being cool enough, that you're not being accepting enough of unrighteousness, and that you will be immediately labeled as insensitive or ruthless in one way or another. And it's a very, very strong, multitudinous pressure. It's like a whole bunch of flies just flying around you, and it's just by the raw pressure of the numbers that you get intimidated into behaving in a certain way, not because you have believed in the law or the principle, but because of the pressure that's built around you to get you to think a certain way. And it's important to be aware of the flies. Regardless of the environment, just be aware of that. That wherever a Canaanite spirit is in control, you'll have all these Jebusite flies trying to control you, trying to watch what you're saying in order to judge you and condemn you if you're not abiding by the laws that have been decreed by the Amorite king that rules in that territory. So that's a second thing that the Lord wanted us to talk about. And it's also very important that the flies, the Jebusite flies, apply a judgment that's always based on what you might call secondary parameters. It's never based on the merits of the law that is being imposed upon you, or that you're being pressured into accepting. It's always in terms of secondary issues that have nothing to do with the law. In other words, the Jebusite spirit doesn't come to tell you the merits of the law that it is offering you to accept. It's not the merits of the law, but very secondary issues, like, for example, with the woman and the serpent in the Garden of Eden. The serpent was giving her reasoning, as we shared in the previous video, to get her to think her to get her to change her laws, the laws that operated in her mind. And but the argument that the snake used, that the serpent used, was to get her to think that God was jealous, or that God was selfish, and that God was holding something back that he was not going to give to her or to Adam. And so therefore the reasoning that was being done was based on a personal attack. That's what the Jebusite spirit does. So he tried to portray God as a selfish being who didn't want man and woman to be like him. So it's always in terms of envies and conflicts. It's always in terms of emotional parameters that the Jebusite spirit gets people to abide by a certain law or idea, instead of speaking about the merits of the law and pointing out what is good about that law. Point 1, point 2, point 3. Instead of that, it always appeals to soap opera type things. Like if you watch a soap opera, you will see that it's full of intrigue and people conspiring against one another, and jealousy and envy and lust and all these things that are happening. So it's all very soulish, very emotional, and that's how the Jebusite spirit gets you to do things. So when you're being pressured into accepting a law, the question you should be asking is this law being put into my brain based on the merits of the law? Is that what is being told to me? Or am I being fed a whole bunch of ancillary or like superficial nonsense that has nothing to do with the law itself? Am I being are these spirits trying to motivate me by envy, jealousy, paranoia, or things like that, soulish things that have nothing to do with the law itself? And if so, then you can more or less begin to assume or suspect that it's a Jebusite spirit talking to you. Now, another thing that the Lord wanted us to share is the fact that that when you have Jebusite judgments, even though it may not seem like it on the surface, Jebusite judgments have this tendency to hold you back, to keep you from moving forward, whereas God's judgments try to move you towards new dimensions, and dimensions that sometimes are very uncomfortable. It's as if, for example, let's put it this way: you have a social group of people, and these people have a certain belief system, and so this belief system and this environment has a whole bunch of Jebusite flies flying around here, trying to pressure people to think a certain way, and you're trapped or caught right in the middle of it. When God's judgments come, when they come to your life, they try to get you out of your comfort zone and to go into new territories where you grow, where you can grow in the Spirit and get a new understanding in your relationship with God. But the Jebusite spirit does the opposite, even though it may seem that it doesn't on the outside, on the surface. The Jebusites, when you are trying to break away from that Canaanite crowd, the Jebusite spirit comes to force you to be like them. So instead of pushing you out of the crowd, it tries to trap you and enslave you within that environment. So it keeps you from moving forward. It tries to shackle you to the environment. So that's one thing the Jebusite spirit does. It shackles you, keeps you from moving forward. And even though on the surface it might seem like it's trying to promote you to accept new things and to modernize your thinking in a certain way, like with the woman in the Garden of Eden, the serpent was actually trying to prevent the woman growing in the spirit. The woman and her husband Adam growing in the spirit, and in fact, when they accepted the serpent's thinking, they, instead of moving forward, they fell back, and that's when humanity fell into the state that we are in right now. So that's another important thing. The Jebusite spirit holds you back, prevents you growing, and the judgments of God push you towards new zones, new uncomfortable areas. And the Jebusite spirit may try to do things that are uncomfortable to you, but they are uncomfortable to you because of your conscience, not uncomfortable because of the ease with which they can be done. It's as if the Jebusite spirit pushes you towards bad things, but pushes you along with the crowd, like, okay, be like everybody else and act this certain way. So that it may push your comfort zone, but it's pushing you to be with other people. It's not, the judgments of God are very one-on-one. They push you towards a desert, towards a wilderness, just like the Israelites who came out of Egypt and into the wilderness. They push you towards an uncomfortable place where you know that when you go there, you'll be alone in a certain sense. But that's how you begin to grow in the spirit. So that's a very important thing to consider as well. And now, having said that, one thing that the Lord wanted us to share also is that the Jebusite spirit can take very different forms, very unrighteous and very lust-oriented, you could say, forms, or it could take very sanctified and pious forms. And there's a problem with that. If you have, for example, let's say two groups. Let's just portray two groups here with these, these shapes. And let's say this is the church, a Christian church, and this is some sort of social group that is very earthly. And you have a Christian. Let's say you have a Christian who goes to church every day or every week, a young Christian, and he has contact with people from this social group. Now, maybe this social, as he ventures into this territory, in the midst of this social group, by necessity or by choice, you never know. I mean, you can't be separated. We are in this world, but not of it. So being a Christian doesn't mean that you will lose all contact with non-Christians. That would be impossible. And besides being impossible, it would be unhealthy, because it means that you have decided not to save those who are on the other side. So you have to have contact with the world in one way or another. That's why convents and all those things are of the devil. So the thing is that so this young person is starting to have contact with people from this social group, and then let's say that this social group starts with its flies trying to put Jebusite pressure on this young man to do something that is not right. and the problem that I have seen with many young people who have this situation is that in order to break away from the pressure that is being placed on him by this Jebusite group, what many Christians, especially young Christians, tend to do is to appeal to another Jebusite force to counteract this one. And what they do is, when they get asked, why are you willing to do what all of us are doing? Why are you holding back? And one thing that they say, I'm a Christian, and we Christians don't believe in doing this, that, or the other. And what is that person doing by saying that? He's appealing to another social group, to the group here of church believers. It's as if to say, I don't participate of this because I belong to another social group. And in my social group, this type of behavior is not accepted. So this person is thinking in terms of what these other brothers or sisters may think if he does something wrong. So he's thinking about the flies in the church, not about what God may or may not think. And he's appealing to another force that these people will understand. It's as if he says, if I say to them, God says this is not right, these people will just laugh at me and say I am a religious nut. But if I say, I can't do it because I grew up in a different environment and I'm not allowed to do that, what he's appealing to is the strength of another group. It's as if to say, I am countering the force of this group by appealing to the force of this other group. And the force of these groups is by numbers. So he has to appeal to the number of people who believe what he believes in. So what if he was the only person who believed what God wants to do? Then this person would stand no chance because he has no group to appeal to. And I pray that you're perceiving in the Spirit what the Lord is trying to say through this. And that's why there's so many or so few Christians who are moving forward in the Spirit, because a lot of their faith, a lot of their quote-unquote righteous behavior is based on the strength of the number of Christians behind them. And they appeal to the strength of that social group behind them and to the social Jebusite pressure of that group to prevent themselves falling to the temptation of this other group. It's like the blood and the Crips. It's I don't do what the Crips do because I hang with the blood. That's the sort of response. It's not instead of saying this is wrong because of this, that, and the other, because the Lord has declared this and that and the other. Instead of speaking of in that authority of a oneness with God, they have to appeal to another soulish force, a soulish group of people, and that's why Christianity is so weak. And therefore, also, you have so few people who can venture out into new territories, because if they don't have 3 or 4 people coming up with them to that new territory, they are unwilling to move to that because they cannot stand on righteousness on their own. And that points to Isaiah 63, and that's a very important principle to keep in mind, especially in terms of the green horse of the apocalypse. And let's just read that quickly. Isaiah 63, if I'm not mistaken, it says, "Who is this that?" Verse 1. "Who is this that cometh from Edom with dyed garments from Bozrah? This that is glorious in his apparel, traveling in the greatness of his strength. I that speak in righteousness, mighty to save." Notice that it says I, not we. I that speak in righteousness. One individual, mighty to save. "Wherefore art thou red in thine apparel, and thy garments like him that treadeth in the wine fat?" And then he says, "I have trodden the winepress alone, and of the people there was none with me, for I will tread them in mine anger, and trample them in my fury, and their blood shall be sprinkled upon my garments, and I will stain all my raiment." Notice it says, I have trodden the winepress alone, and of the people there was none with me. In other words, it's those who are in the anointing, in the righteousness of God, will be willing to trample on the unrighteousness, to judge it and to curse it and to destroy it, even if they're the only ones doing it. But they do wish that others were with them, because that would increase the power or the speed with which the restoration will come. Not because they need the validation, even though at a human weak level we do need that, we do feel the need to have that validation, but they don't. But that need doesn't prevent them doing God's will, even if it's if they're the only ones doing it. And notice also that, let's continue reading here just to see another principle. For the day of vengeance is mine, is in mine heart, and the year of my redeemed is come. This is a very prophetic passage about the end times. Notice how it links up redemption with vengeance. For the day of vengeance is in mine heart. In other words, notice this sounds like a very bitter person, somebody who has revenge in his heart. For the day of vengeance is in mine heart, and the year of my redeemed is come. To release the redemption of God into the earth, you have to have people with this, who are imbued with the zeal of vengeance of God, the spiritual vengeance. We're not talking about literal or earthly Jebusite vengeance. We're talking about spiritual vengeance. The zeal, the willingness to curse things unto destruction, to bring judgment into entities, into people, and to declare the righteousness of God and the unrighteousness of people who have been hiding that unrighteousness for centuries, and to be bold and decisive about it in the authority of the Spirit. When you do that, then you begin to release the restoration of God. But the two things come together, and that's why the church hasn't manifested the redemption of God, because it rejects that spirit of vengeance. And then it says in verse 5, and I looked, and there was none to help, and I wondered that there was none to uphold. Therefore mine own arm brought salvation unto me, and my fury it upheld me. Notice it says, and I looked, and there was none to help, and I wondered. In other words, I was amazed that there was none to uphold. In other words, God is expecting others to join in the trampling, in that process of judgment and cursing that has to be done in order for the Lord the Lord's coming to be manifested. That's why in 1 Corinthians, if I'm not mistaken, or 2 Corinthians, it says 1 Corinthians, if I'm not mistaken, it says anathema, and then it says maranatha. Anathema means curse it is, and then it says maranatha, which means Lord, come. So in other words, the Lord is saying, for me to come, you have to curse things unto destruction first. Otherwise, I will not come. So there is this need for that. But notice there's a certain amazement, because God is expecting us to join Him in the Spirit, to join the remnant in the Spirit. But the remnant looks around and says, nobody else is willing to do this, because this message is too harsh, too bitter for the matriarchal soul to accept and absorb. So therefore it says here, and I looked, and there was none to help, and I wondered that there was none to uphold. Therefore mine own arm brought salvation unto me, and my fury it upheld me. In other words, since there was no emotional support from others, his own fury upheld him and said, I will continue doing this even if I have to do it until the day I die. But I will not surrender, I will not compromise, and I'll continue to issue these judgments and to declare these words until the redemption of the Lord has come. And notice that it's not a soulish vengeance, because there's always redemption behind it. There's always this desire to see the vision of God fulfilled and the potential of people manifested, the God potential in people manifested. It is not just, destruction for destruction's sake, a heart full of bitterness that just wants to destroy stuff. There's always the redemption and the glory of God in the background. And that's a difference between the anger of the soul and the anger of the spirit. The anger of the spirit is always redemptive in nature, even though it can destroy people, it can send them to Sheol, to destruction. But it's always with the vision of seeing the salvation and the potential, the God potential in man being manifested. Then it says, and I will tread down the people in mine anger and make them drunk in my fury, and I will bring down their strength to the earth. And then in verse 7 it seems so contradictory. It says, I will mention the loving kindnesses of the Lord and the praises of the Lord, according to all that the Lord has bestowed on us, and the great goodness towards the house of Israel, which he hath bestowed on them according to his mercies, and according to the multitude of his loving kindnesses. Notice that it mentioned loving kindness, it mentions the mercies of the Lord, the goodness towards the house of Israel, and the bestowing, in other words, the giving of grace. So to the matriarchal soul, saying all those things right after talking about vengeance and treading people down and having your garments sprinkled with the blood of your enemies doesn't make sense, because the matriarchal soul does not understand anger in the spirit, does not understand it. Therefore, when it does get angry, it gets angry the wrong way. And we share in the Romans postings where we start to study Romans 13 on the Shamah-Elim website. We share on what the difference is between soulish anger and spiritual anger, and it is sort of the beginning of that. There's a lot to say about that, but in those postings we share a bit on that, and we pray in the Spirit that some of you may have already seen that, those postings. So the thing is that so we've talked about the Jebusite spirit and the flies that are in Canaanite atmospheres, and the type of judgments and pressure that they put on you. So now let's go quickly to the other points that the Lord wanted us to talk about. For some reason, as you may have noticed in one of the other videos related to Genesis 10, 15 through 18 that we posted, the Lord had me writing a few Chinese characters, and as I was doing it, I was wondering, why are you making me do this, Lord? And as I was meditating on that, the Lord kept saying to me, there is a message I want to give through those characters. And as you may recall, we talked about the city of Shang, and I'm sorry if I'm not pronouncing it correctly, but it's I think it's Shanxi. That was one of the first ancient capitals of China, and if I recall correctly, it's the first capital of the United Kingdom of China. So the capital city was called Shanxi, and it's written like this: Shan, Shi, two words. Shi means west, and this Shan, this word apparently doesn't mean anything on its own. It's like a proper name, like the name of the city. But if you break it down, you can see that it's made up of two components. This radical, which I believe is pronounced fu, and this other word that means that is pronounced jia. And so the Lord had me looking at this word and thinking about what it means. And just as a side note, this is not the official way the word is written in communist China, because as some of you may know, in the 1950s and 1960s, the bastard Mao Zedong, who is right now burning in hell even as we speak, to the glory of God the Father, he and his communist bastard party decided to change the way Chinese is written, and they began a simplification process, and they invented new characters, and they called it simplified Chinese. And you could say that on the natural level it seems like a laudable effort, but if you look at the arguments that they began to use, they made it sound like the Chinese people were so stupid that if you didn't simplify the characters, then their learning process would get stymied, which is totally ridiculous, because anybody who has grown up in China prior to the communist takeover could tell you that learning Chinese characters, if you're in the middle of that culture, is not as complicated as the bastard Communist Party would have you believe. And what they did by simplifying characters and artificially creating these new characters is a typical example of how left-oriented people who have gone in the spirit of Kara have this tendency to kind of lord it over you and to impose things on you from above, thinking that they know better than you. Instead of allowing the language to flow, to develop and to flow in a natural way, and for the Chinese people to by themselves start producing these new characters, if there really was a need to simplify the characters, instead of that, they decreed it, from the top down, and told people how to rewrite certain characters. And that's why, as a matter of principle, I oppose simplified Chinese, because it's an artificial creation. And this is very important even with this character, because this character is written differently in simplified Chinese, in the artificial characters that the bastard Communist Party of China designed. And when you look at the simplified version of those characters, you lose part of the message that is embedded in this picture, in this pictograph. The word Jia, if you look at it, notice that if you remove these two little things here, these two, you get what's equivalent to the word Da in Chinese, which means big. So you take something that's big and you apply two like clamps on both sides, and you start pressuring it. So this correlates with the parasite pressure and the Hivite pressure that we talked about in the previous video, that start clamping down on the greatness of a person. So that's a very important principle. And this character and what's happening here is a figure of what has been happening to China for centuries. So those of you who have a calling to pray for China and who believe that you've been called to pray for the release of the Chinese people, please bear this in mind. This is one of the things you have to fight against. You have to fight against the unclamping of the greatness potential within the Chinese people, because there's a parasite and a Hivite pressure that's been applied on it that is preventing it from manifesting its fullness. And in the spirit, you have to come and put and take both clamps and break them away from the people of China, so that the potential in the Chinese people can be manifested. So that's a very important principle. It's a very simple thing, but I believe in the spirit that there is something to that. And if you apply that in prophetic intercession and in prayer for China, if you feel called to pray for that nation and that people, I can assure you that this principle will release a great deal of things. And we will share later on in this video, if God willing it doesn't get too long, why some of the evidence that I've seen in my heart as to the veracity of what we just shared right now. Now, the other thing also is that this radical fu, which can also be written, I'm sorry if I can't write this correctly, but let me just give it a try. It's something like this. This is like an alternate way to write this radical fu. literally means abundant, ample, or numerous. So when you put it together with this word that literally means and this is what this word means. Jia literally means to press from both sides, to place in between. So that's why it has this picture of these two. And this looks like a person. This word ren in Mandarin and Chinese means person. So you see these two persons pressing on the greatness of somebody else. So the thing is that this word means to press together from both sides, to place in between, and it can also be used to say clip or folder, which makes sense because a clip presses from both sides and keeps things together. And so that's what this word means, and this word means numerous. This radical has a connotation of numerous or ample. So you see the ample or a very multiplied pressure to press from both sides and keep people under that oppression. And so that's what the Lord had us to say about that. Now, another quick thing that we want to share is that the word, if you just take this, the word jia, it's interesting to consider that there's a word or a combination of characters. Let me just try to write them down here. My calligraphy is not that good. When I was younger, it was a bit better, but it's because of lack of practice, it's not that good anymore. If it was good at all to begin with. But so you have this word jia, zhu tao, jia zhu tao. I hope I'm pronouncing it correctly. This is the name of a flower, which in English is the Nerium indicum. Nerium indicum. And this flower, if you go to the internet and find and read about it, you will see that it's a poisonous flower, and it contains cardiac glycosides, which, interestingly enough, rodents and birds are relatively insensitive to. So, if a bird eats one of these flowers, it's not going to be that affected. Or if a rodent, like a squirrel or whatever, ever decided to eat one of these flowers, it wouldn't get intoxicated that much because they're not that sensitive to it. But it was interesting when I read about this that other mammals, and the article on Wikipedia said other mammals such as dogs and humans, they are relatively sensitive to it. So a human can get very sick from eating these flowers, and dogs too. And the fact that they mentioned dogs and humans was, to me, more than a coincidence, because as you may recall, in one of the verses that we were studying, one of the descendants were the Hivites, the Archite, and the Perizzite. I hope you can read that. The Perizzite, and these are the two village spirits, and the Archite had to do with a Canaanite dog. So it's a dog being pressed on both sides enclosed on both sides by the two village spirits. As you may recall from the other video, we were talking about how these two spirits enclose, because they're village spirits, they enclose people in this dog nature. And so it's interesting that this plant, which is related to this character, which has to do with sin and shangxi, sin, but not the word sin, but the person sin. So there's a connection there, and that this flower is toxic to dogs and humans. And so humans and dogs, in that sense, are become one when it comes to this type of flower, because they're both very sensitive to it. It can cause nausea, excessive salivation, which correlates with a dog in its urges, the archaid dog that we were talking about, with this urge to trapped in the addiction, in the Canaanite addiction, excessive salivation and vomiting, and dogs return to their own vomit. So there's this strong connection to dogs in that sense. And the interesting thing is that this type of flower can cause the heart to race very quickly, to palpitate very quickly at first, and then it slows down to below normal, because what it does is it increases cardiac output by increasing the force of contraction. So notice that there's always this correlation or association with the concept of pressing together. So this chemical in your body causes your heart to contract more forcefully, so it increases cardiac output. But then after that, it gets it to it overcompensates by going below normal, and that's what happens to people who are trapped in Canaanite addictions. They have these highs, and after the highs, they go to a very low level, and they need the high to get to kind of get back to life, and then they come below that again. And we saw that also, like at the end, it's manifested in the Zemarite figure of the two woolens that we were talking about in the previous video, where one woolen starts off wet with everything else dry, and then it ends up all dry with everything around it wet. And that's how the Canaanite lives. He starts off very wet and ends up very, very, very dry compared to everybody else. So that's those highs and lows that are related to the Canaanite spirit of addiction. So the thing is that so there's a connection there, and interestingly enough, this flower, Nerium indicum, is typically found around dry stream beds, which correlates with the dry woolen of the Zemarite consequence that we talked about previously. And it also it points to that and a dry stream bed, a river bed, refers to something that was very wet, because a river was running over it at one point, and then it ends up being very dry, like the opposite of what it was before. So there's always this contrast between something that's very wet and then something that then becomes very, very dry, and that's where these flowers tend to be very abundant. So that there's no coincidence in that, and all of this is related to China. And I pray that you keep that in mind if you have this heart for China. Now, just as a side note, this word zhu means bamboo by itself, and tao means peach. I have no idea how this is related. You might have an inkling if you meditate on it. I don't know what that means, but this is bamboo, which is very common in China, and tao, which means peach, literally. But I don't know how that plays into this whole notion. And if you just this radical, which I think is pronounced something like mu, or I cannot remember, it was so long ago, but this means wood or tree. And this, if you take this by itself, this radical by itself, it's pronounced zhao, which means omen or million in communist China, and trillion in the true Chinese government in Taiwan. In Taiwan, this means trillion, and in the communist region, it means million. So, for some reason, there's something about multiplied oppression in the middle of all this, but I still am not able to understand what's being said in these three words together. Now, the other thing that we wanted to talk about quickly, and this video is running a bit longer than we expected, is about the modern name for Shanxi. This is the as we said, and I'm sorry if I'm not pronouncing it the way it should be. This is the ancient name of the capital city, Shanxi. But if I'm not mistaken, the modern name for it, for the city in that region, is Xi'an, and it's written like this. And Shi means west, so there's always this connotation of the Balaamite spirit. And An here, this means peace. But interestingly enough, this radical, if you just look at this part of the character, this means woman. And you might see why, because this is if you just put a head on here at the top, these are the legs, and this is a woman who is expecting, who is pregnant, and that's where that symbol came from. So this is why this means woman in Chinese. So you can see that, and you have a roof over it. Now, this can be taken in a positive and a negative sense. If you take it from a negative perspective, it's as if this is like the crown on the woman. So this speaks of a matriarchy. It's a woman who is ruling over the house with her crown on it. So this is a matriarchy, spirit, a soul matriarchy spirit. But if you took it in a positive sense, you could say that this is the covering of man, and woman submitted under the covering. But if you take it from a negative perspective, it speaks of the female soul being crowned and in control of the household. So that's and the fact that this word is used for peace means that if you take it in a negative sense, it means that the soul matriarchy is seeking a state of peace. Peace speaks of completeness, where there is nothing missing, nothing lacking. That the soul matriarchy believes that we will finally have peace when she is in control of everything. And that's what leftists always believe in. That's what the communists and people like that always believe, that once we, the matriarchal soul, are in control, then everything will be hunky-dory and there will be world peace. When in fact all that they do is bring oppression and destruction. So that's another thing that the Lord wanted us to talk about. And finally, another one quick thing, and before we mention a couple of other final points, is that if you look at the list of Genesis 10:15 through 18, we had Sidon and Heth at the top, as you may recall, mentioned in verse 15, I believe, and then in verse 16 you had the Jebusite, the Amorite, and the Girgashite. And then in verse 17 you had the Hivite, the Archite, and the Sinite. And finally in verse 18 you had the Arvadite, the Zemarite, and the Hamathite. And if you look at these three, the Jebusite, the Amorite, and the Girgashite, these three spirits, as we share on the website, those of you who visit the website regularly will recall that the Jebusite, the Amorite, and the Girgashite spirit combine to form the spirit of Cain. So, and Cain is the enemy of the red horse in the red horse stage. So we have the spirit of Cain and the red horse being depicted here in this first stage. So you could say, so if this is the red horse stage, the enemy during the red horse stage, this is the second seal. The first seal of the apocalypse is the white horse. So we can say that this is the enemy during the white horse stage, Sidon and Heth. And now here we have the Hivite, the Archite, and the Sinite. And as we saw, the Hivite spirit is one that calls you to delight in pleasure. And the Archite spirit is the spirit of addiction. And so you're getting enclosed here in a spirit of self-indulgence and self gratification, and therefore this correlates with the spirit of Balaam, which is the spirit of bastardizing the blessing of God and using it for banal purposes, as we share on the website. And this is the enemy of God during the the black horse stage. So we see the red horse here in the leadership, and then the leadership kind of gets toppled after the red horse stage. It falls from heaven, and so now we have, it morphs into Balaam, and instead of portraying the leadership, we have the people who are being followed here, because Balaam is now trying to hide. That's why these are the spirits that are shown here below. But at the top, you have the Amorite, Hittite, Gon Girgashite dominating here at the top. And I hope that makes sense. And then in the final verse, you have the consequences: the Arvadite, the Zemrite, and the Hamathite. And by projection, you could say that this is the green horse stage, the enemy during the green horse stage. When you are in the Korah stage, then you have become a roamer, a person, a wanderer. That's what the Arvadite represents. A Zemrite, you have become a dry woolen after having been a wet woolen. And the Hamathite, you become a prisoner. After being so free, supposedly, you are completely trapped in the fortress of the Canaanite spirit. And that's where you end up in Sheol, just like Korah ended up in Sheol, because Korah is the enemy of God during the green horse stage. So you can see that the horses of the apocalypse are being portrayed, and what the enemy is doing at the Canaanite level during each of the stages. And I pray that, we just said this very quickly, but I pray that kind of resonates to a certain extent. Balaam is the spirit of self-indulgence. So Balaam, as we share on the website, is an Amorite, Hittite, Gon Girgashite. But as that leadership is hovering, the people below are indulging in Hivite, Arkite, and Sinite activity in this self-indulgence. And in the green horse stage, you have the people just in their lowest form. You have roamers, wanderers, purposeless wanderers, who are dry and who are trapped under the spirit of Canaan. And the reason, and one of the things that the Lord spoke to us about all of this, and with the confirmation of a sister in Christ who said this to us, is that as we have shared these things about the Canaanite, the way the Canaanite spirit hunts souls down, it's as if something was released in the spiritual atmosphere, and I've been attacked greatly since then, starting that very same day. It's like I got attacked spiritually because of that, because behind all of this is there's an attack against the spirit of Jezebel, and I curse you, Jezebel, in the name of Jesus. And I know that you will try to get back at me immediately, because that's what you always do, but I still curse you anyway, and I'll curse you until the day I die. And I will never be intimidated by you in the name of Yeshua. But having said that, when we said these things, regardless of whether or not they were understood or absorbed or believed, something happened. And it's no coincidence that a few days later, Whitney Houston ended up passing away. As you know, she passed away, you could say, 4 days after we posted the videos on the Canaanite hunt. They were posted on the 7th of February, 7, which goes with the 7 evil spirits, and she passed away on the 11th of February, and 11 are the 11 descendants of Canaan that fit in with the 7 evil spirits, as we saw in the other 2 videos. And as you know, she was a person very much trapped in a great deal of addictions. She had been involved in a Christian environment, and I think one of her last songs that she sang in public was "Jesus Loves Me." So she had a lot of connection to Christ and to God in her early life, but she was trapped by the Canaanite spirit, and she was hunted down by it, and then you can see what happened to her at the end. And one of the things that I found interesting is that in one of the stories on the internet about her, it said that in one of her final, and I think her final public appearance, she looked disheveled and didn't look very well at all. and she seemed to be like wandering all over the place. And when I read that, it said literally she seemed to be wandering all over the place. That made me think immediately of the Arvadite spirit that we talked about. And it said that that story said that her hair was dripping wet, maybe with sweat or some sort of oil. I'm not quite sure exactly what it was, and I don't think the writer of the story knew either. But her hair was dripping wet, which kind of made me think of the Zemrite, the wet woolen versus the dry woolen. And her looking so bad compared to everybody else also reminded me of the two woolens. After being so wet compared to everybody else, now she seems so dry and shriveled compared to everyone else. So that there you were seeing the manifestations of the Zemrite spirit, and it's no coincidence that she passed away these last few days. Something was released in the spiritual atmosphere, and I also believe that something was released on behalf of China, even though there's going to be attack and there's going to be a counter response in the spirit from the Chinese evil snake. But something was released on behalf of China, as these things have been said. And therefore, to me, it's no coincidence that Jeremy Lin, an NBA player for the New York Knicks, began to rise exactly this week. And as I was sharing with a sister in Christ, Lin is the Mandarin pronunciation of the Cantonese surname Lam. And as some of you may have noticed, probably in one of the videos, the Lord had us mention that surname when we were talking about the villages. That my father used to live in a village where everybody had our surname, my surname, Leong, and they would fight against the people of other villages, throwing stones at each other, all the kids and all that stuff. And we mentioned the village of Lam. And when I said it, I wondered why I was saying that name. And then a few days later, or maybe the next day, I read the story about Jeremy Lin, which is pronounced Lam in Cantonese, and Lam means forest. So there's something there that I can't quite understand. But the resurgence of this person of Chinese descent amongst the New York Knicks, and New York is the epicenter, or shall be the epicenter of God's revival in the latter days. To me, none of this is a coincidence, and the fact that his name is Jeremiah, points to the prophet Jeremiah, which has to do. And Jeremiah was a red horse rider, so it's as if there is the spirit of the red horse rider fighting against the Chinese cane. If you read the cancer posting on the website, which if I'm not mistaken is a question and answer posting, it's entitled Cancer, you will see how the spirit of Cain is strongly related to China. So it's as if the red horse rider has risen up against the spirit of China. And in the latter days, there will be a move of God that will bring down that spirit, and Mao Zedong and all his gang shall be trampled under the feet of the righteous, and no longer shall that bastard and the people who support him be glorified and praised. Cursed be those who praise such a bastard, such a murderer, a mass murderer who was so callous and was willing to destroy millions of lives just to promote a false ideology. Cursed be anyone within the Obama administration or anywhere else within any university who praises that man who, as I'm speaking, is burning in hell. And I rejoice at that thought that he is burning in hell right now for all the crimes he has committed. But that doesn't take away from the damage he did and the damage he's doing to this day to the Chinese people. So this word of judgment goes out against that spirit that's still being glorified and praised in China. And I pray that whether in life or death, I will be given the privilege of seeing that spirit toppled and spat upon and denigrated the way it denigrated the God potential in the Chinese people. May the Lord bless you.